11:20. This is BBC Radio. A very good morning to you. It's a highly secretive organisation whose members include royalty, politicians, bankers and business leaders. It's called Bilderberg. It's rumoured that wars and future US presidents are decided by the group. For the first time in 15 years, its annual conference is being held in Britain. But what exactly is Bilderberg? Let's ask TonyGosling, who's a journalist who's been researching the group for nearly 20 years. Tony, good morning to you. Welcome to BBC Radio Els.
Hi, Jason. One thing I would say, a couple of things that you missed off there are also media and also politicians, because those are the two people, or sort of groups of people in this Bilderberg conference I have the biggest problem with. I don't think politicians should be walking over the threshold of that hotel swearing themselves to secrecy, and the same with the press. I mean, if the Economist and Financial Times and people like that are in there, then they should be writing about it in their newspaper, not swearing themselves to secrecy. But if you want a reason why our politicians today don't really seem to do very much that we want them to do, and why our vote seems to be counting less and less, there's a whole understanding that that there's a disenfranchisement. Many people just don't feel it's worth voting anymore. This is one of the reasons. Bilderberg, you've got Ed Balls in there, and you've also got George Osborne. And both sides, supposedly, of the economic debate, sitting in the same secret conference, deciding and discussing the future of the NATO countries and, and the future of the wider planet. And one of the biggest problems is that they're doing things like they're discussing the future for Africa, challenges for Africa, without a single African allowed in the building. I mean, this is like a throwback to the old colonial days, the very worst of the British Empire, the sort of slavery days, and the idea that these people need their futures discussing and deciding by us. So that's the biggest problem, I think. I mean, it's almost like a collection of the world's biggest Bond villains, the sort of criminals. There are actually, Henry Kissinger is one of the world's top war criminals. He started in 1969 with the bombing of Cambodia illegally. He then organised a coup in Chile, which led to the assassination of a democratically elected president, Allende, and not tens of thousands, but thousands of people disappeared and tortured in dungeons. Indonesian coup, the invasion of Cyprus, some people will remember that. That was also been proven to Kissinger have his hands in that. So, and it's not just war crimes, it's also the crimes in the financial sector. HSBC have been proven in the States to have been laundering money for the Mexican drug cartels. I mean, they were leaving piles of 150 bodies outside villages who were challenging the Mexican drug cartels, but HSBC were running their loot, their cash, around in their armoured vans. There are something like 5 of the top HSBC executives in that conference, and also Barclays and the LIBOR fraud. There's still not been any proper prosecutions at the top level of Barclays for that. All we've seen is out-of-court settlements, both for the money laundering and for the LIBOR fraud. Now, for those of your listeners who pay mortgages, all of them at some point will have suffered from this LIBOR fraud. They've made billions out of these frauds, and they're
but these are all your opinions. These are all your suspicions of what's going on inside those closed doors.
No, hang on a minute. The HSBC stuff, for example, has all been proven in courts in the US, and fines have been paid for it. I don't think fines should have been paid. I think doors of bankers should have been broken down in the middle of the night by police officers, and those bankers should have been arrested for those frauds. Certainly at least put on trial. They haven't even been put on trial. There's been out-of-court settlements. Now, if you or I commit a criminal offence, we would expect to go in front of a magistrate or in front of a judge. No, it seems that you've got a sort of super elite, people who are above the law.
But a lot of the reporters yesterday were talking about lobbying, about influence, about transparency and democracy. Why are you so suspicious?
Well, the reason I'm suspicious is because, exactly what I've been saying, is that if what they're lobbying for is things like deregulation, isn't it? And where has that got us? I mean, they're asking us to trust them, the Bilderbergs, aren't they? But what have they done with our economy over the last 6 or 7 years? Made an absolute mess of it. I started looking into these guys about 18 years ago, after I finished at the BBC, and I started looking at an articles database in Reuters, found a whole list of who was at these meetings, secret meetings. And this wasn't available on the internet, so I just put it onto the internet. And I found within a few days there were thousands and thousands of hits, and my service provider phoned me up and said, well, what's going on here? We're going to have to close you down. You're getting too much traffic on your website. So I had to shift service providers. And the thing that really, really frustrated me and made me realise that there was something going on here was that I found for the first 20 years, that is from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, Bilderberg Bilderberg was chaired by a former SS officer before the war, that is, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. I mean, he actually says that in his biography, that he was in the SS before the war. He married into the Dutch royal family subsequently. But, in 1975, he had to leave, Prince Bernhard, as chairman of Bilderberg, because he was embroiled in the Lockheed scandal, which some of your older listeners may remember, as $1 million bribe was paid to him by Lockheed Martin, I think it was just the Lockheed Corporation at the time, to get the Dutch Air Force to buy Starfighter jets, which, by the way, had little tiny wings and kept falling out of the sky, so they weren't much use. But anyway, he took his $1 million bribe, and he was disgraced and discovered by a chambermaid in a hotel who found a bit of paper and gave it to a Dutch newspaper. So if you're trying to tell me we should trust these people, really, I'm sure your listeners can see that they're not really that trustworthy.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Very nice to talk to you. That's Tony Gosling.
Charlie Skelton is a comedy writer who's reporting for The Guardian on the secretive comings and goings at the annual conference. I spoke to him earlier and I asked him how would he describe the Bilderberg conference.
A thing which happens once a year, which is a giant security operation, which Watford is just finding out, and a large international policy summit. And obviously they're very secretive, so what you can find out is a little bit limited. But this year there is a little bit more dialogue between the press and the Bilderberg group, so that's good.
So we've got a load of rich boys in a room together, having a few pints of lager, and they're trying to change the world. Effectively, that's what they're doing then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what they're drinking. I don't know if it's lager. It's probably more expensive than that.
Yes.
And it's not just rich boys. I mean, there's a lot of billionaire industrialists there, absolutely. A lot of gigantic wealth. But also, I think it's more important to point out that there's people like, the head of the IMF and the president of the European Commission. There's people with genuine policy-making power there.
But why are they keeping this so secret? If they're going to be talking about things which could make a difference, why are they not coming out and saying, right, we're talking about this and we think we, as a whole, as an organisation, can make a big difference across the UK and across the world? Well, why are they being so secretive?
Well, you know what, that is the big question. That is the big question you've just asked. And I think what's emerging is that there isn't really any reason for them to be so secretive. And this year, for the first time, and this is historic, this has been going 59 years, for the first time, under pressure from journalists, they've actually hired a media communications company, and they put a little email address at the bottom of one of their statements. Unfortunately, they got scared, and a few hours later, they took it off again from the website. So, but these little acorns. I feel like this little nervous creature has sort of nosed its way out into the air and is now ducking back again. But I think we can coax it out and have it behave normally, like any normal policy summit would behave.
But in real terms, between now and Saturday, you're going to be reporting on this, so you're effectively reporting on nothing, because you can't get into that room. You're not going to know what's going on, are you?
Well, I mean, you can, at the very least, you can infer from some of from the delegate list who is there, and they do release a sort of sketchy agenda. So you can put a few pieces together, and you can see that, for example, General Petraeus, the ex-head of the CIA, is there, and he's there with a few neocon friends, and he's working for Henry Kravis, the head of KKR, a massive private equity fund, and that sort of smells a little bit of war and a little bit of warmongery. So there are little, you can make sort of inferences from just raw data, but also you can, by turning up, and there's a lot of media turning up, share information and just cover it as best you can, and by applying pressure, you can make a difference and make this conference more transparent and more modern in a way.
Across beds, hearts and bucks.
This is BBC Three Counties Radio.
Well, it's a story that everyone's talking about this morning. A meeting of some of the world's most influential figures is taking place amid tight security in Hertfordshire today. It's the annual Bilderberg conference, which sees politicians, industry leaders and high-ranking financial and academic officials gather over 3 days at the Grove Hotel near Watford. I still think it is in Watford, but there you go. Another argument for another day. It's a slight change, though, of a scene from last year when they met in the Seychelles. With hundreds of protesters expected to gather outside, local taxpayers are having to foot the bill, the police bill. Tony Gosling is is a journalist who has been researching the Bilderberg conferences for the last 20 years. Tony, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Justin.
Thanks for joining us live across Beds, Hearts and Bucks. First of all, again, let me just put this question to you. A lot of people still asking, what is this conference? Can you tell us in layman's terms what this conference is actually about?
I certainly can, but I just want to correct you on one fact. Is that last year they actually met in the United States, not in the Seychelles. That was a joke actually put out by the Daily Telegraph a few days ago.
So our researchers have fallen for the joke, is that what you're saying?
Right. And to be honest with you, to start with, I would say your churchgoers in your three counties should be crossing themselves today, because if you hadn't noticed, it's the 6th of the 6th. And if you add up all the numbers in 2013, there's another 6 there. But joking aside, I mean, this is a bit like all the Bond villains you've ever imagined getting together in the same place. And I'm afraid the news is that fascism is alive and well in the EU. I mean, the individuals at the moment, right across the European Union and also in the States, are actually being rewarded, as you might have noticed, for their ruthlessness and greed. And particularly the bankers. There doesn't seem to be any proper check on what these bankers are up to. We've had all these different types of crises, with HSBC being involved in money laundering in the United States, and they're trying to extradite brokers and bankers over to the US to be prosecuted there. We've had Barclays and the LIBOR, the billions of pounds of mortgage payers' money being taken away from them. We've also had the payment protection insurance. They call it mis-selling. I would call it fraud. If you actually sell somebody something that isn't what you told them, it wouldn't do what you told them it was. It's a form of fraud. So that's what I think this is. It's a really a rather nasty collection of people who've made rather a lot of money out of us.
I want to play you something, because a lot of people are making comments about the protesters. I went down to the Grove last night and a few of them started arriving. This is one of the protesters. Now, just take a quick listen to this.
Global temperatures are rising, increasing all the time. The polar ice caps are melting. The sea levels are rising. The islands in the South Pacific are disappearing. The people are evacuating. Whole countries are going underwater. There are tornadoes. There's been hurricanes in America, West Nile disease, drought. There's famines, there's typhoons, there's cyclones.
And all the people inside the Grove are responsible for all of those things.
They control the capitalist system, which is destroying the planet, and humanity will be extinct by the end of this century.
I mean, come on, Tony. We've got somebody outside the Grove, and he's blaming the people inside that building for all the things that are going wrong on our lovely planet. Is that the calibre of protester that we can expect over the next 3 days?
I mean, I think you can probably get better than people who are saying that the moon landings never happened over the weekend. There's going to be a lot better than that. But another thing I'd like to point out is that they certainly don't control the world, the Bilderbergs. They're very much focused on just the NATO countries. And this is no coincidence, because the whole thing started not long after the birth of NATO, after the Second World War in the 1950s. And one of the things that really irritates me, and we're very lucky actually to have this year, to have the list of participants and agenda, because normally they will only give the public that and the press that after they're all leaving in past years, many of the past years. So, you know, that one of the things they're discussing, as you may have noticed on there, is Africa's challenges. But they're not inviting a single African. In fact, no Africans are allowed to go to Bilderberg conferences.
How does that work,
it's only the NATO countries.
So they're talking about Africa, but nobody from Africa's invited.
Well, it sounds a bit insulting and a bit like a throwback to the old bad old colonial days. I mean, one of the main movers and shakers there is Henry Kissinger. I mean, he is anyone who actually looked into him would describe as a war criminal. In 1969, he agreed and organised a secret bombing of Cambodia. He organised a military coup in Chile and in Indonesia. Also, he's one of the people behind the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Now, a military coup is not a nice affair. What happens is that, for example, in Chile, is the democratic president was murdered, and Pinochet was installed, and then we had thousands and thousands after that of disappeared people. So, you know, a war criminal, very much like the sort of Bond villain I was talking about before. But then we've also got a rather toxic mix of our politicians going in too. The main ones being Ken Clarke, George Osborne, Ed Balls and Mandelson. And hang on a minute, you know, I've pinched myself Balls and Osborne, both in the same organisation. Maybe we're not really getting Labour Party economic policy or Conservative Party economic policy. We're getting Bilderberg economic policy, because we've had this week Ed Balls coming out with an incredible statement that he thinks that we should be introducing means testing on various welfare benefits. Now, hang on a minute, because I thought that the Labour policy was towards social security